How you doing, boys and girls? Mr. Powell here, again with some more Civil War, and we're pretty much about at the end. This is gonna just about wrap things up for the Civil War. So I have a little bit of a timeline here, a couple names I'm going to familiarize with, and we'll just kind of go through it. It's a really interesting story. So Lincoln wins the election of 1864, beats his Democratic opponent, and he's sworn in on March 4th, 1865. Now, presidents always swear in on January 20th of the following year. But back then, it was on March 4th. They changed the date in the Constitution. So he swears in, and his second inaugural address is pretty well known. I'm going to read some of it here, and maybe a couple other paragraphs from this book right here. Bill O'Reilly's and Martin Dugard's Killing Lincoln. Pretty solid book. Anyway. The man with 6 weeks to live is anxious. He furrows his brow, as he does countless times a day, and walks out of the Capitol building, which is nearing completion. He is exhausted, almost numb. 50,000 men and women stand in the pouring rain and ankle-deep mud to watch Abraham Lincoln take the oath of office and to begin his second term. His new vice president, Andrew Johnson, has just delivered a red-faced, drunken, 20-minute ramble, vilifying the South that has left the crowd squirming, embarrassed by Johnson's inebriation. So when Lincoln steps up to the podium and delivers an eloquent appeal for reunification, the spiritual message of his second inaugural address is all the more uplifting. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, and to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The president intones humbly. Despite his exhaustion, Lincoln is charismatic and momentarily energized. Suddenly the sun bursts through the clouds as he speaks. Its light is enveloping the tall and outwardly serene Lincoln. But 120 miles away in Virginia, the Virginia Railroad junction of Petersburg, any thought of serenity is a fantasy. The Confederate Army, under the command of General Robert E. Lee, has been pinned down in the city for more than 250 days by Union forces under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant. Though living in trenches and reduced to eating rats and raw bacon, Lee's men will not surrender. Instead, Lee is making plans to slip out of Petersburg and escape to South Carolina. If he succeeds, Lincoln's prayer for a reunification of the United States of America may never be answered. America will continue to be a divided nation, North and South. United States of America and the Confederate States of America. So, as Lincoln does his second inaugural address, his killer, John Wilkes Booth, is really only a few yards away. Booth is watching Lincoln. He's enraged at Lincoln. He's a supporter of the South. And he's planning to kill Lincoln. So he's right there. A little while later, about a month or so later, Lee surrenders at Appomattox. The surrender just came about as you guys are going to watch the little film clip I gave you on the battle at Petersburg. But he was basically out of gas. I mean, he didn't have bullets left or food or anything. His troops are at the end of their rope. So he surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. He sends a message through the lines to General Grant to meet him. General Grant rides out to meet Lee. They chat for a while on friendly terms. Lee's very much like a polished Southern gentleman at this meeting. He's got a brand new uniform on. He looks great. He's got a great sword, a very high value sword. Grant rides up. He just wears an average sort of private's field uniform. It's got the little stars for a general, but that's it. Muddy. He's been in the field and stuff. So he's not looking too good. But it's very much a contrast in their styles. Grant gives very generous terms to Lee. Lee's not going to be held prisoner. He's not going to be hanged at the neck. Nothing like that. All the Confederate soldiers are basically allowed to go home. They can go home back to their farms or back to whatever other their business was and get back to work and sort of live on. So if that's what's going to happen to Lee and the Army of Virginia, then that's pretty much what it's going to be for everyone else. Like you can't let Lee go and then go after the guys who are the more junior officers or junior soldiers. That's the way it's going to be. So between the soldiers, they worked out like a pretty solid peace arrangement. And that's in keeping with what Lincoln had wanted. He wanted to kind of get back to normal as much as possible. All right. So the names you see here are the assassins, and it's really shocking. There's this huge plot to kill Lincoln, and it's not necessarily just John Wilkes Booth. It's some other guys here involved as well. Basically, this is supposed to be a mass assassination to kind of decapitate the American government. These two guys here, they were supposed to take out the Secretary of State. Seward was his name. They were supposed to kill him. George Atzerodt is another person in this little plot here. He's supposed to kill the vice president. Vice President Johnson. And of course, Booth is going to kill Lincoln. All right. So I'll kind of go from the lesser important guys to the main show of John Wilkes Booth and Lincoln. But anyway, Lewis Powell and David Herold were supposed to kill Seward, the Secretary of State. And you may recognize the name Seward. Seward was the guy who's responsible for Seward's icebox. A couple years later, while he's still in government, he purchases Alaska, or he's instrumental in having our government purchase Alaska from the Russians. So-called Seward's icebox, because a lot of people didn't really want it. Anyway, Lewis Powell and David Herold were supposed to kill this guy. They were supposed to assassinate him. They rode up to his house one night. David Herold was out front holding a horse. Lewis Powell went in, and Seward was actually convalescing. Like, people get into car accidents and they get pretty mangled sometimes. He actually was in a horse accident. He was in virtually like a body cast. Part of his face was in a cast and stuff like that, because he got pretty wrecked in an accident involving horses. So he should be pretty much an easy target. There's like a butler kind of guy there. Lewis Powell pushes his way past the butler. He claims that he had like some medicine to give to Seward. And then Seward's son comes out and confronts Lewis Powell in the hallway of the house. And Lewis Powell pulls out a pistol, and he basically beats this guy like almost half to death, because the pistol actually comes apart in his hands. He's beating this guy so hard. And then he goes into Seward's room. Seward's basically immobilized, can't move at all. And Lewis Powell pulls out a big Bowie knife and starts just hacking away at his face and throat area with the knife. The cast deflected some of the stabs from Lewis Powell's knife, and then Seward kind of tried to mooch down, between his bed and the wall, and that probably saved him. But with other people in the house coming to see what's going on and ladies screaming and stuff like that, eventually Lewis Powell figured, hey, I think I got this guy, and he runs out of the house. You also have to consider it's dark. When it's dark back then, it's really dark. There's no electric light. It's not like he can turn on the light and see how well he did. So he leaves. Herold had already gotten scared off earlier by all the people and the commotion in the house, he thought he was going to get caught, so he left, and these two guys just kind of escaped separately. George Atzerodt was supposed to kill the vice president. He basically just drank a lot of alcohol and just never quite did it. He was kind of a loser. Then we get to this guy, John Wilkes Booth, going after Lincoln. So a lot of you probably already know that Booth is Lincoln's murderer, but you might not know much about him. Booth is from Maryland, and Maryland was one of those states on the border where about half the people are for the South and about half the people are for the North. He was for the South. He came from a family of actors. The actors, they're probably like a little eccentric by the normal standards of the day because he's an actor. And he's a pretty successful actor. It's not really like today where you're going to live in Hollywood and be super rich, but for back then he was doing pretty well for himself. And for some reason he was able to avoid the war. He was never drafted into the Northern armies. He never volunteered to go fight for the South, despite the fact he loved the South so much, but he just kept doing his acting and stuff like that. So I would say he's kind of a wacky guy. A lot of times you think somebody tries to assassinate the president, or there's some attempt on the president's life or something like that, and you think it's probably going to be by this highly trained commando operative guy. No, it's just a whack job. Booth was a whack job. You know, Lee Harvey Oswald was a whack job. John Hinckley, or is it John Hinckley? David Hinckley? Hinckley, who tried to kill President Reagan. It's a whack job. Usually that's just the way it works. So anyway, since Booth was an actor, it kind of set him up perfectly to attack Lincoln. Lincoln went to go see a play on April 14th. It was called My American Cousin. Ironically, he didn't even really want to go see the play. He wanted to go see a different play called Aladdin. I guess it's kind of like Aladdin the movie, I don't know. But he wanted to go see a play called Aladdin, and his wife's like, no, we want to go see Our American Cousin. He's like, all right, I guess that stuff's all the same, whether you're a president or whoever, right? So he goes to see this play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Booth is intimately familiar with Ford's Theater. He goes to Ford's Theater all the time. He works in Ford's Theater. He knows all the backstage areas. He knows secret doors. He knows everything about Ford's Theater. People are used to seeing John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater. So if he's walking in, you know, the people who are the staff there or whatever just say, hey, how you doing? Like they just see him all the time. So he basically sets it up to where he's watching this play. He's in a sort of a room besides Lincoln's balcony, and he's cut a little hole in the wall with a knife so he can kind of go peep through and see Lincoln. Lincoln and his wife are in there. Another Union Army officer is in there with his wife, and Booth can kind of peek through. He waits for a certain line in the play, and once that line is spoken by the actors on the stage below, John Wilkes Booth pops out, and he's got a single shot little Derringer. It's got, you know, it fires like a little marble kind of looking thing, and he comes out and just shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. After that, he intends to vault out of the booth, or balcony, I should say, onto the stage, and then he's going to kind of run away. So as he's vaulting out of the balcony, part of his foot catches onto a like a drapery kind of thing that they would have hanged over the balcony, and he fell awkwardly and broke part of his leg, like near the ankle down at the bottom. So he has to sort of limp away, and he runs out into a back alley where he's got a horse waiting and rides off into the night. So he actually has a pretty long escape. He intended to do this decapitation of the American government here, and then somehow that would revive the Confederacy, and he would ride out. But as time went on, I think he intended to try and get to Mexico and live out in Mexico. He thought his travels through the South would be easy. People would believe he was like a hero and take care of him and stuff like that. But ironically, the people in the South were completely disgusted by his murder of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, for as much as they hated Abraham Lincoln, at least Abraham Lincoln and General Grant, those were the guys who they fought against in a straight up fight. It wasn't this sort of, back alley murder kind of thing. And they were a little bit embarrassed by Wilkes Booth, claiming to be for the South. Like he wasn't brave enough to fight in the army, and now the people in the North are going to be very vengeful and hate the people in the South even more and try and take it out on them. So the people in the South ultimately were victims of this process too. But Booth has a long road ahead of him. He's got to ride through the rest of Virginia. Then he crosses the river into Maryland, which is no mean feat. The Potomac River, at the point he crosses, is this massive wide river. He has to hide out in swamps for a couple days. He hires a smuggler to get him across. He fails the first time trying to get across. He just kind of drifts to a different part of the same side. And then finally he does get across the river and travels through Virginia for a little while and finally makes it to this place called the Garrett Farm. And at the Garrett Farm, he's confronted with some Union cavalry rides up because there's a huge manhunt on for Booth. And then finally he's shot. He's shot in this little barn type thing, like a warehouse. And he's shot and the thing burns down, so he gets killed. He gets killed there. With Lincoln, there's a huge state funeral. They're marched through D.C. and his body lays in state, and then it's taken back to Illinois, and he gets buried in his home state of Illinois. So that's basically the end of Lincoln and pretty much the end of the war. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.